Let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a story so dark, so twisted, that even decades later people still whisper about it like a nightmare they can't completely wake up from? Because that is exactly what this is. This isn't just a story about a crime. It is a descent into a specific kind of American hell. Picture a man, a black man, towering at 6'7", a mountain of raw talent, hungry for a seat at a table that was never set for him. Picture him walking through life with a notebook full of poems he wrote as a child, chasing music like it was oxygen, believing with every fiber of his being that hip-hop was the only thing that could lift him out of the shadows that had followed him since birth. Now, shift the frame. Picture that same man, barefoot, completely naked, drenched in blood that isn't his own, standing in the middle of a Los Angeles street in the dead of night. His head is tilted back toward the obsidian sky, his mouth agape, screaming at a god who feels 1,000,000 miles away. He looks like a glitch in reality. He looks like the end of the world. When the police arrived on that April night in 2002, they didn't ask questions. They didn't look for context. They didn't see the broken neck or the years of untreated trauma. They saw a silhouette of a nightmare. They pointed their flashlights and their cameras at him, and they gave him the only labels the media knew how to sell: monster. Cannibal. The devil of horrorcore. Within hours, the name Big Lurch was no longer associated with the rising star of the Bay Area rap scene. It became synonymous with one of the most gruesome urban legends in history. The headlines screamed about a rapper who had allegedly used his teeth as weapons, a man who had supposedly eaten his way into a life sentence. It was the kind of spectacle that America devours, a cocktail of black violence, drug-induced madness, and the dark underbelly of a music genre that flirted with death. But here is the part nobody ever tells you. The part that doesn't make it into the sensationalist documentaries or the tabloid blurbs. Before the headlines, there was a shattered spine. Before the mugshot that haunted a generation, there was a recording studio filled with ghosts and gang members who were never supposed to be there. Before the terror that unfolded in that apartment, there was a man sitting alone in the agony of withdrawal, drowning in a sea of pain medication that had been stripped away, reaching for anything that could numb the hurt. Tonight, we aren't here for the shock. We aren't here for the spectacle. We are walking into the world of Antron Singleton, not to defend the indefensible, but to understand the human equation that the justice system ignored. We are here to trace the trail of lost evidence, the missing fingerprints, the conflicted lawyers, and the grieving mother, who, despite losing her daughter, believes the wrong man is rotting behind bars. This isn't just a horror story. This is a forensic audit of a tragedy. It's the story of a man's life rising, collapsing, and finally disappearing into a system designed to swallow black men whole. This is the truth about Big Lurch, the man who was buried alive by his own lyrics, and a reality he can no longer remember. Before the world labeled him a beast, before the courtroom, and before the single moment that would erase everything he had ever worked for. Big Lurch was just a boy named Antron Singleton, born on September 15, 1976, in the sprawling heat of Dallas, Texas. Texas in the late 70s and early 80s wasn't a playground for a tall, quiet black kid trying to find a voice. The world around Antron was loud, a cacophony of crime, systemic poverty, and parents chasing second shifts just to keep the lights on. But inside Antron, there was a different kind of noise. At 7 years old, while other kids were outside running through dust clouds and dodging the Dallas heat, Antron sat alone with a pencil and a notebook. He wasn't drawing superheroes. He was writing poems. Soft words, sharp words. Words a child shouldn't have to feel, let alone translate onto paper. He didn't know it yet, but he was building the skeleton of the artist he would become line by line, using language, the way some kids use prayer. He was sensitive, observational, and gifted with a sense of rhythm that seemed to vibrate in his very marrow. By the time he reached his teens, hip-hop had become the undisputed lifeline for Black youth across America. Dallas was pulsing with a raw, underground energy. Antron, now towering over his peers, at 6'7", with long, sweeping limbs, stepped into this world head first. He started rapping over other artists' beats, studying flows like they were sacred texts. Local shows turned into small crowds. Small crowds turned into a local buzz. People started whispered about the tall kid, the one they called Lurch, a nickname earned because of his resemblance to the towering butler from the Addams Family. What began as a schoolyard joke became his shield. Antron was gone. Big Lurch was born. But Dallas felt too small for a man of his stature. In the early 90s, his father relocated to Vallejo, California, and Antron saw his window. He moved to the Bay Area, a region that at the time was the most fertile ground for independent rap in the country. This was the era of the mob music wave E40 Mac Dre and the legendary Sibo. Vallejo wasn't just a city, it was an academy of hustle. When Lurch arrived, he didn't walk into a record deal. He walked into a garage. He slept on a cold floor, on borrowed blankets, starting over with nothing but his notebook and his hunger. But the Bay has a way of recognizing real talent. He eventually crossed paths with Mac Mall, who introduced him to the renowned producer Mike Mosley. Mosley had worked with the giants Tupac Shakur E40, Richie Rich. He saw something in Lurch that the world had missed, a massive, intimidating physical presence, contrasted by a highly disciplined poetic mind. Mosley gave him a couch to sleep on and a mic to bleed into. In 1996, Lurch hit the jackpot. He landed a feature with E40 on a track called Record Haters. For a kid who had been sleeping in a garage months earlier, this was a cosmic shift. His voice, heavy textured and haunting, became a staple of the Bay Area sound. He joined the group Cosmic Slop Shop, signed a major deal with MCA Records, and released the album The Family in 1998. He was standing on the precipice of true, sustainable stardom. But life has a cruel way of checking your momentum. In September 2000, one day after his 24th birthday, Antron got into a car to drive back to Texas for his grandmother's funeral. It was supposed to be a journey of reflection. Instead, a drunk driver crossed the center line and turned metal into a cage. The impact was cataclysmic. When they pulled Antron from the wreckage, his body was shattered. His neck was broken. He survived. But the Antron who crawled out of that car was biologically different from the one who got in. The doctors fused his spine and gave him morphine to numb the white-hot lightning of nerve damage. But here is the thing about trauma. It creates a hole that medicine can't always fill. When the legal prescriptions ran out, the pain remained pulsing, constant, and relentless. In the desperate space between agony and sanity, Antron reached for a different kind of relief. Not for a high, but for numbness. That was when PCP, known on the streets as Sherm, entered the equation. It offered him a way to detach from a body that felt like it was constantly on fire. He didn't know that by inviting the drug in to kill the pain, he was also inviting a demon that would eventually kill his future. The poet was still there, but he was now writing from inside a haze of chemicals and a shattered spine. The stage was set for a tragedy that no rhyme could ever fix. By the year 2001, Antron Singleton was a man living in two different worlds. In the world of the Bay Area rap scene, he was a legend in the making, a 6'7" giant with a voice that could rattle windows. But in his private world, he was a ghost. He was living with the constant grinding agony of a fused neck, his nervous system firing off alarms that no amount of prayer or poetry could silence. It was in this state of extreme physical and psychological vulnerability that he walked into the arms of a business arrangement that would ultimately become his cage. Enter Stress-Free Records. On the surface, it looked like a lifeline. The label was run by Milton Grimes, a man whose name carried immense weight in the black community. Grimes was the high-powered attorney who had represented Rodney King. He was a symbol of justice and power. He promised Antron a comeback, a major budget, and a path back to the top of the charts. But for Antron, the deal with Stress-Free was anything but stress-free. There was a profound conflict of interest at the heart of this relationship. Milton Grimes wasn't just Antron's label boss. He was also his legal counsel. In the music industry, this is a red flag the size of a billboard. It meant that the man responsible for protecting Antron's legal rights was the same man profiting from his labor. Antron was no longer just an artist. He was an asset. And to increase the value of that asset, the label leaned heavily into the horrorcore aesthetic. They wanted Lurch to be darker, scarier, and more violent. They wanted the music to reflect a world of monsters because monsters sold records. The environment Grimes provided for Antron to record in was a recipe for madness. The studio was located in a high-tension area of Los Angeles, frequently crowded with gang members and hangers-on who had no connection to the music. Antron was a member of the Bloods, but the studio was a revolving door of shifting loyalties and unspoken threats. For a man with a broken neck, who was already self-medicating with PCP to deal with his pain, this environment was a breeding ground for hyperparanoia. PCP phencyclidine is a dissociative anesthetic. It doesn't just numb pain, it detaches the user from reality. It creates a state of pharmacological dissociation, where the brain loses the ability to distinguish between its own thoughts and the outside world. When you combine that drug with the high-pressure, high-threat environment of a gang-affiliated studio, the results are catastrophic. Antron began to believe that people were out to get him. He felt like he was being watched, hunted, and exploited. He tried to walk away. He tried to flee back to Texas to find some semblance of peace, but the system had its hooks in him. A drug charge in Texas sent him to jail, and when he bailed out, it was Milton Grimes who showed up again to save him. But the price of that salvation was a return to the studio in California, the very place that was feeding his addiction and his paranoia. Antron was caught in a loop. He needed the label to stay out of prison, but the label was the very thing driving him toward a mental collapse. In those final months leading up to April 2002, the sessions at Stress-Free Records became increasingly erratic. Antron was recording songs with titles like I Gave It To Him and Texas Boy, lyrics filled with the violent imagery of the horrorcore genre. To the outside world, it was just art. To Antron, the lines between the lyrics he was writing and the hallucinations he was experiencing were starting to dissolve. He was drowning in a cocktail of sherm smoke and survival instinct. The people around him saw the decline. They saw the big kid getting lost in the fog. But in the rap industry of the early 2000s, as long as the reels were turning and the bars were being spat, nobody stepped in to stop the train wreck. They just kept the lights low and the smoke thick, waiting for the next hit record. They didn't realize they were presiding over the final hours of Antron Singleton's sanity. The studio of shadows had done its work. The man was gone, and only the monster that the label had marketed was left standing in the dark. To the world, the story of April 10, 2002 is a closed book of gore and madness. The narrative sold to the public was simple. A rapper high on PCP lost his mind and committed an act of unspeakable cannibalism. But when you step away from the headlines and into the forensic reality of that Los Angeles apartment, the simple story begins to fracture into 1,000 unanswered questions. The victim was Tynesha Isais, a 21-year-old mother of two. She wasn't a stranger to Antron. They were friends, living in a house that had become a hub for the neighborhood's drug activity. On that final afternoon, the atmosphere inside the apartment was thick with the chemical stench of PCP. Reports indicate that the residents were dipping cigarettes into liquid sherm for hours. In this environment, time doesn't exist. Logic doesn't exist. There is only the now, and for Antron, the now had become a hallucinatory war zone. When the police arrived, they found a scene that looked like a set from one of Antron's horrorcore music videos. Tynesha had been brutally murdered, her chest cavity opened, and her lung removed. Tron was found wandering the street naked, covered in blood, barking at the sky like a rabid animal. It was the perfect image of guilt. But the forensics tell a more complicated tale. Toxicology reports revealed that Tynesha had massive amounts of PCP in her system, so much that experts argued she could not have ingested it voluntarily. It appeared as though the drug had been poured down her throat. Furthermore, investigators found fingerprints on a heavy scooter used to strike Tynesha fingerprints that did not belong to Antron Singleton. There were bloodstains on a back door handle and a stray shoe that suggested someone had fled the scene. These pieces of evidence, which pointed to a third party, were never fully pursued. Then there's the most gruesome detail, the alleged cannibalism. While the prosecution argued that Antron had used his teeth to tear Tynesha's flesh, the defense pointed to a much more mundane, yet equally terrifying factor. There was a pit bull in the apartment, a dog known to be aggressive and attracted to the scent of blood. The autopsy showed that the bite marks on Tynesha's body matched the predatory pattern of a canine, not a human jaw. Yet the media had already decided on the cannibal rapper narrative. It was a story too profitable to let facts get in the way. When Antron was finally booked into the Los Angeles County Jail, he wasn't a man coming down from a high. He was a man in the middle of a total psychotic break. He had no memory of the night. He didn't know Tynesha was dead. He didn't even know his own name. For 2 weeks, he sat in a cell, trapped in a pharmacological fog so dense that he wasn't even aware he had been arraigned for murder. The tragedy of April 10th wasn't just the loss of a young woman's life, which was an undeniable horror. The tragedy was also the immediate dehumanization of the suspect. Because he was a large black man, because he was a rapper, and because the crime was so visceral, the system didn't see a man in need of a psychological evaluation. It saw a monster that needed to be caged. They ignored the missing fingerprints. They ignored the third-party DNA. They took 21 grams of horror and used it to weigh down a man who was too broken to even realize the trial had already begun. When Antron Singleton finally stepped into that California courtroom in 2003, he wasn't entering a sanctuary of justice. He was walking into a slaughterhouse where his own creative soul had already been laid out on the block. The trial of Big Lurch was never about a forensic search for truth. It was a character assassination, a meticulously designed theater of horror where the line between a man's art and a man's actions was intentionally erased to ensure he would never see the sun again. The most chilling part of this drama wasn't the prosecution. It was the man sitting right next to Antron, his defense attorney, Milton Grimes. This was the same man who owned the record label that held Antron's contract. Think about the absolute predatory sickness of that dynamic. The man responsible for saving Antron's life was the same man who stood to profit from his infamy. Grimes had a choice. He could have fought for Antron's humanity by calling neurological experts to explain how a shattered spine and a PCP-induced psychosis had physically hijacked a human brain. Instead, Grimes stood back and allowed the state to use Antron's own creative work as a noose to hang him with. The prosecution's primary weapon wasn't a smoking gun. It wasn't a DNA match. It was a CD. They played Antron's unreleased horrorcore songs for the jury lyrics filled with dark, hyperbolic fantasies of monsters and cinematic gore. In any other world, this was just music. It was a genre much like a Stephen King novel or a slasher film meant for entertainment. But in that courtroom, the state stripped away the metaphor. They told the jury that these weren't just rhymes. They were premeditated confessions. They argued that Antron hadn't just committed a crime, he had simply acted out the script he had been writing in the studio for years. This was a devastating racist trap. By conflating the performer with the person, the system successfully stripped Antron of his identity. The jury didn't see a father, a poet from Dallas, or a man suffering from catastrophic physical trauma. They saw a monster who had been rehearsing his atrocities on tape. It was the ultimate weaponization of black creativity. While white screenwriters are praised for their dark imagination, this black man was told his imagination was a crime scene. And to ensure the jury stayed terrified, they made sure Antron looked the part. Throughout the trial, he was kept on a near-lethal regimen of antipsychotic medications. He sat at the defense table in a catatonic stupor, eyes glazed, body slumped like a hollow shell. He wasn't allowed to wear a suit to appear professional or human. He was presented in a way that reinforced every primal fear the prosecution wanted to exploit. He looked like the beast they had painted him to be, because they had drugged him into a state where he couldn't even defend his own name. Milton Grimes's failure was total, and it felt intentional. He didn't challenge the unidentified fingerprints. He didn't question the stray shoe at the crime scene. He didn't even push for a proper insanity defense that could have sent Antron to a hospital instead of a cage. He stood by and watched as his own artist was buried alive by the very songs that were supposed to make them both rich. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They didn't need the facts because they had already heard the confession in the music. They found him guilty on all counts. As the judge read the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Antron sat there, too medicated to realize that the poet had been executed by his own poetry. The system didn't want the truth about that night. It wanted the monster of horrorcore. And on that day, it got exactly what it paid for. After the sentence was handed down, the world moved on. The cameras were packed away, the tabloid headlines were archived, and Big Lurch became just another statistic in the sprawling American prison system. For most people, justice had been served. A life for a life. A monster behind bars. But in a small, quiet home away from the glare of the media, the one person who had every right to hate Antron Singleton was asking the questions the police refused to answer. Carolyn Stinson, the mother of Tynesha Isais, did not follow the script of the vengeful, grieving parent. While the prosecution used her daughter's name to build a monument of horror, Carolyn began to look at the jagged gaps in their story. She knew her daughter, and she knew the world Tynesha was living in. And the more she looked at the truth presented in court, the more she became convinced that the monster the world had convicted was not the man who had actually taken her child's life. In an act of radical clarity that stunned the legal community, Carolyn Stinson began to speak out not against Antron, but in defense of him. She pointed to the boyfriend. A man who was in the house that day, a man with a documented history of violence against Tynesha. She spoke about the frantic phone calls her daughter had made in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, expressing fear not of a drugged-out rapper, but of the person closest to her. Carolyn began to highlight the physical evidence that the cannibal narrative had conveniently buried. She asked about the bloody footprints found at the scene, footprints that didn't match Antron's feet. She asked about the fingerprints on the heavy scooter used in the attack prints that remained unidentified and unpursued. Most hauntingly, she asked why the DNA evidence found under her daughter's fingernails, the biological signature of a struggle, had simply vanished from the police record. To Carolyn, this wasn't a triumph of justice. It was a rush to judgment. She saw a system so eager to lock up a horrorcore rapper that it had completely ignored the trail of a killer who might still be walking free. This is the ultimate heartbreaking irony of the Big Lurch saga. The victim's own mother became the loudest voice calling for the innocence of the man accused of eating her child. Her forgiveness was not born of weakness or delusion, but of a desperate, agonizing search for the truth. She saw Antron Singleton for what he truly was. A man who was clearly suffering, a man who was dangerously high, but a man who was likely a convenient scapegoat for a much more calculated crime. Her stance created a fracture in the narrative that the state of California tried to ignore. If the mother of the victim doesn't believe he did it, why was the case closed so fast? But the system doesn't like to admit it. Made a mistake, especially when that mistake involves a high-profile beast. Carolyn Stinson's voice became a lonely echo in a canyon of silence. She remained a mother without a daughter, forced to watch from the sidelines as a man she believed was innocent rotted in a cell for a crime he couldn't even remember. In this chapter, the story shifts from a simple crime of passion and drugs into a complex web of systemic failure. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. If we are so quick to believe the worst about someone because of the music they make or the drugs they take, are we actually blind to the real monsters hiding in plain sight? Carolyn Stinson saw past the Big Lurch mask. She saw a tragedy that was much deeper than the headlines allowed, and in doing so, she became the only person truly seeking justice in a room full of people only seeking a conviction. Today, the man once known as Big Lurch is no longer a headline. He is a ghost living in the machinery of the California state prison system. To the younger generation of hip-hop fans, he is a campfire story, a urban legend whispered on Reddit threads or analyzed in true crime podcasts. But inside the walls of his cell, Antron Singleton is still the poet. He is still the man who once believed that words could set him free, even as those same words became the bars of his cage. For over 20 years, Antron has maintained the same steady, haunting narrative he doesn't remember that night. Not because of a legal strategy, but because his brain was a fractured landscape of broken bones and chemical static. He has spent more than 2 decades trying to reconcile the Big Lurch that the world fears with the Antron that he knows himself to be. He continues to write. He continues to speak to anyone who will listen about the trail of evidence that went cold, about the fingerprints that didn't match, and about the system that saw a monster instead of a medical emergency. But the story of Big Lurch is bigger than one man. It is a cautionary tale for the entire culture of hip-hop. It is a stark, brutal warning about the horrorcore trap, the dangerous game where artists are encouraged to flirt with the darkest parts of the human psyche for profit, only to find that when real darkness arrives, the industry and the law will use their art to bury them. We celebrate the gritty and the raw until it becomes inconvenient, and then we pretend we never saw the warning signs. We have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of our entertainment? We watched a man with a broken neck and a shattered spirit get pushed into a recording studio filled with drugs and predators, and we called it authentic. We watched a lawyer with a clear conflict of interest lead his client to a life sentence, and we called it the legal process. And most tragically, we watched a mother beg for the truth while we settled for the spectacle. If there is any light in this dark saga, it is found in the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the life sentence, despite the labels, and despite the betrayal, Antron Singleton refuses to be the monster the world wants him to be. He is a reminder that justice is not always found in a verdict, and that the truth often lives in the gaps between the evidence. As the sun sets over the prison walls of California, the echo of Big Lurch remains. Not as a threat, but as a question. A question about fairness, about mercy, and about the way we treat the most broken among us. Antron Singleton turned his breath into poetry, then into a nightmare, and finally into a silent plea for a truth that might never come to light. Rest in peace to Tynesha Esaias, a life cut short in a whirlwind of madness. And for the rest of us, stay safe, stay aware, and remember that sometimes the stories that are the easiest to believe are the ones that hide the most dangerous lies. The poet is still writing, the ghost is still waiting, and the beat, for better or worse, goes on.